We've come to the end of the course, Hospice, Palliative Care, and Religion. And firstly, I wanted to thank all of you for participating. I was very struck by the quality of the assignments and by the discussions. And many years ago, I was very hesitant to do online teaching because I was always concerned with participation. That's a very important part of it for me. But I have actually found with the discussion boards that sometimes people participate who wouldn't in person. So I've been very pleasantly surprised. And certainly in the case of this course, there was a lot of very personal, emotional material. And I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the course itself and then moving into talking about the final exam. So when I was choosing an image to finish with, I Googled hospice, palliative care, religion, and it's very interesting to see what comes up. And again, it was a version of an image of a hand holding another hand. And even though the butterfly is supposed to be the official image of hospice, palliative care, I would argue that actually it's the hands that are the image. And so this is clearly symbolic, and so it's a very condensed symbol of the whole thing. And I've chosen one where it's a group of people rather than just two people for my picture, although there's many versions of this. And so it gets at what the course is about for me. And so, so this idea of compassionate presence being so important to the whole philosophy of hospice, palliative care, and religion, that people are at the center, including family, friends, community, as well as the patient and the medical practitioners. And so I think it makes sense that this is kind of de facto become the symbol of hospice and palliative care. So the course developed somewhat organically as a result of the fact that Dr. Susan Strigley and I have overlapping interests. And when I first came to Nipissing, I was already teaching health, healing, and religion in a variety of settings, often to nurses. And then she was teaching death and dying. And so we realized that we should develop a kind of suite of courses that address this, because we have many, many students, and this is true across North America. The classes on death and dying are full, which I think speaks to our cultural moment where there are so few spaces where this can be spoken about openly, where it's not stigmatized. And also, obviously, Nipissing has a large nursing faculty. So addressing all of these needs kind of, and that it relates to our research as well. So it fit very nicely. And so my underlying concern was to kind of put religion back at the center of hospice and palliative care and make sure that it gets taken seriously. And so that was sort of the impetus for designing the course. So we're going to be talking about that in some detail, that idea of, in some ways, the success of hospice and palliative care are a challenge because it's very easy for it to just become absorbed into the larger system rather than changing the system. So we'll talk about that as I talk about the final exam. So in terms of the final exam, again, as I said, it's not just about repeating facts, and so clearly you have to have done the readings and watched all the material and read it, but I want to see that you're reflecting on it and thinking about these larger questions. So this is not exhaustive. It's not like this is going to be replicated on the exam, but I want you to think in terms of the larger principles, and then the questions will be reflecting it. So there'll be short answer and then essay, but all will be in essay form. No point form is permitted in a humanities course. And so I want to start out by framing it in this way for you to start thinking about these larger overarching questions. So what are the religious origins of hospice and palliative care? And the easiest way to get at that is, what are the origins of those words? And so it turns out these are very expressive, both the word hospice and its long history, and also palliative care. And so you'll need to go back to that section of the course and perhaps rewatch it or re-listen to it. And how do these concepts continue to be expressed into the present? And so we see in the very earliest origins, it comes out of the ideal of compassion, care for one's neighbor, these kind of overarching theological concepts, and then they're lived out through the practice of hospice and palliative care. And that's just one of the many ways they're lived out, but that's a key one in terms of what we're talking about in this course. And so you'll need to look at also the role of the deacons, the deaconesses in the very early church, and the role that they were fulfilling in response to certain Christian ideals of care of the neighbor. Number two, it can be argued that hospice and palliative care is a social movement rather than a medical intervention. Where do we see this? So this is a larger argument I've been making throughout the course, that even though probably the vast majority of people, if they've heard of hospice and palliative care, think of it as medical care, and clearly it is, that I would argue it's actually part of a much larger social movement that has to do with end of life and attitudes to death and dying. And that's what moves us into the realm of theology, philosophy, humanities, religion. And so without a doubt, hospice and palliative care have been one of the great drivers of the conversation. They're not the only ones. And so I had you watch that video about the death doula, which is becoming increasingly available to people and known. And so I gave the example of Nipissing Serenity House was hosting a talk by a death doula. So these parts often intermingle, which makes sense. So somebody might be volunteering at hospice and palliative care, but also be a death doula. They don't have to. So, one of the death doulas I know is also a nurse. So these things are all intermingling, but they have to do with cultural attitudes to death and dying. And so we can see that the modern movement, even though it has historical antecedents, the current contemporary model that brings together healthcare and these other concepts comes out of the 50s and 60s, which, as we discussed, was a time when medicine was kind of at the zenith of its social power. And really, as a culture, in many cases, we thought that technology and these new medical treatments were going to solve everything. And so as a result, not that this was ever done on purpose, but death began to be seen as a failure and something we didn't want to think about or talk about. And so a lot of the movement coming out of Kubler-Ross and all the rest of the people that we're discussing comes out of this cultural moment in which many of them, particularly the ones that were working in healthcare, were seeing how this actually played out in how people were treated at end of life. And so I had you talking about that idea of death denial and writing about that idea of death denial, because a person might say, well, so what? People are death denying. What's the big deal? But as we can see, it has actual ramifications. And so what typically will happen is the person and their family has not thought about it till they're at a crisis point. So they've had some kind of a diagnosis and they're forced to do it. So they're sort of thrown into wrestling with these existential questions. And so that dyad at the very beginning of the movement with Dame Cicely Saunders and David Tesma illustrates this, that he's dying alone in a foreign country, and wrestling with these existential questions, and her awareness of that, and then them discussing how this could be done differently and be done better and more compassionately. So we also see that this movement engages in a kind of secular, contemporary way with a good death. And even putting those two words together within the current climate still seems strange, I think, although I think that is starting to change. And certainly religions and spiritual traditions have a lot to teach us about what does a good death look like. And as we've discussed throughout the course, this will be different depending on the tradition. When looking at the history and trajectory of hospice and palliative care, the biographies of its founders is extremely important. Why do you think this is? So in this course, the amount of the course that I took up with biography, I have never done this before in any other course. And it just seemed inevitable, because when I have thought about it over the years, it's almost impossible to imagine how this would have played out if, for instance, Dame Cicely Saunders hadn't been there, because her particular personality, her particular history at that point in time were so vital to taking these pieces that did already exist. We had things like Catholic nursing orders. We had these new approaches to pain management, but she was able to bring them together in her person. And so the fact that she'd been an almoner, the fact that she'd been a social worker, a nurse, and then a medical doctor, the fact that she was a deeply religious person herself. And so the ways in which this all came together, it's very hard to imagine it happening without her. So that's why, for me, the biographies are so important. And then when we look at North America, this ends up being, and again, this points to the fact that it's a social movement. And so when Cicely Saunders goes to North America, she immediately is attracting huge crowds, which speaks to the fact that she's not the only one noticing these issues and these gaps, but she's able to articulate a solution in a very particular way. And so the founders all share certain characteristics, and I invite you to go back and look at those sections of the course. There are differences. We can see with Florence Wald, the religious element isn't as strong. She was definitely within Jewish culture, and we know that Jewish culture talks about care for the sick. So that is absolutely there, even though very few people talk about it when they're writing about her. And this is another reason I want to look at her papers. But also she comes from a social justice aspect, which is a very important part of the Jewish tradition, and she came from a very humanitarian family. So my larger sense that if it isn't a religious driver, it's generally a very strong social justice, humanitarian motivation. And I've talked about this throughout the course, that going against the tide in the way these people did and developing this took so much energy and so much you really need zeal at that point. It goes beyond normal human energy, where you're having to dedicate your whole life, and in some cases everyone around you, their lives, to this larger project. So I think it's something that if it's just a career, you wouldn't do it. So the personal drive and history of the person becomes very important, and we can see that too in the case that I did a short case study of Mathilde Gravel-Bazinet, who was the founder of the hospice in North Bay, and following a very similar archetypal pattern there of somebody who had somebody who worked in healthcare, but also had a deep religious faith. And so how those two came together to make her this kind of driver in the founding of the hospice. And even at a time when it was becoming more known, there were many, many challenges to getting that built. And that was true in each case. So we saw the example of the fact that the word hospice didn't work in the setting in Quebec. And so Balfour Mount had to develop a different terminology of palliative care, and then that got taken up internationally as the term. And so I'll be asking you to reflect on that, why you think we see that kind of archetypal character. Number 4, what are some of the most radical aspects of hospice and palliative care? So I've made this argument that really, if it's taken in its full form, hospice and palliative care is offering a radical, even revolutionary revisioning of healthcare, and certainly end-of-life care. And so this is why I had you do a whole assignment on total pain, because the idea of total pain developed by Cicely Saunders offers a completely different model of the human person. And this is something I talk about at length in my health and healing course, that religions have a very different concept of what human beings are. They're not just a body, and the body isn't just a machine. And so the idea of the dimensions of the human person, which include the mind, the emotions, the spiritual, the social, all these aspects. And so I feel that with this idea of total pain, she was able to boil it down into a way that could be taken into a secular medical setting. Now, that's always under stress, and I'm going to be talking about that more in the next question, where it can very easily get lost. And a number of you talked about this, the idea that it can just be something you check off on your checklist. So to make this a living reality is a whole other issue, and there's absolutely no guarantee of that, and that requires the efforts of everybody involved to push back, because these are giant bureaucracies that we're dealing with. And so total pain, that idea of the many dimensions of human suffering and human care, and the idea also of interdisciplinary teams that emerges out of that. Then if that's the case, you need a group of people, not just the doctor. You need a group of people taking care of these many dimensions of end of life. So number 5, while in places like Ontario, governments have signed on to hospice and palliative care, what are some of the challenges facing implementation in the form that the founders intended? So this is my final question, and very timely because we're at a kind of crossroads with hospice and palliative care. So if we look at the Ontario case, the Compassionate Care Act passed unanimously, which is almost unheard of in governments in Canada. And so it speaks to the fact that no matter what your politics, most of us agree that we want to see a change in how end-of-life care is being delivered. Now, in the case of the government, as I discussed in that section, a lot of those drivers are economic. This is a much more economical way. You don't want end-of-life to be dealt with in the emergency rooms of our hospitals, which are already overburdened. So that's part of what's driving them. So then it becomes how does the sector ensure that these other aspects that make it radical and revolutionary are not lost? And as I said, that's the jury's out on that. And I certainly have seen that kind of creeping medicalization, and it's completely understandable. From the government's point of view, they're funding it, at least partly, and so it has to be up to certain standards of the government. And in my experience, no hospice would dispute that, or palliative care wing would dispute that. They want to be up to the levels of medical care of the province. But how do we ensure that those other elements, the emotional, the spiritual, the social, all these other elements don't get lost? And so what that requires, and I invite you to reflect on this, it clearly requires changes in curriculum. It requires changes in training. And if we just look at the case of Dr. Tremonti in the short documentary that we watched, you can see that her approach is very, very different. So palliative care nurses, palliative care doctors are already trained very differently, but we have to ensure that that continues and expands and is acceptable. And it flies in the face of those structures that want it quick, want it efficient, right? So how do we bring compassionate presence into a situation where people are being rushed or they feel stressed? And also, and that's where also the built environment comes into it. How can architecture and the way that these buildings are designed help the people within it pay attention to these things? I think that is also often overlooked. So I'm going to invite you to reflect on this. And this tension is nobody's fault. It was inevitable when you're trying to bring together things like spirituality and a secular bureaucratic system of medicine, also within a multicultural environment like the one we have in Canada. And so even the makeup of the board of the hospice has to be a certain way, that it reflects all these different sectors. So just for example, Nipissing Serenity Hospice has a seat set aside for Indigenous representation, recognizing the makeup of the population of the area. And so these things become very, very important, and that they're not just window dressing, that they're taken seriously and they're implemented. So I'll invite you to reflect on that and what you think would be necessary to ensure that these elements of compassion and care remain within hospice and palliative care.